Morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We have an extra special speaker today, Dr. Dennis Doster, who is the director of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission Black History Program. So we have a special treat today. And this year, 2019, commemorates 100 years of lynching history in the country. There is a book called 100 Years of Lynching. I'll think of the author in a minute, but so this is a very appropriate for us today, this year. Dr. Doster is has close to 15 years of experience in public history, and he has worked for the National Archives, the Johns Hopkins University, the Alexandria Black History Museum, and additionally he is the adjunct professor in African American Studies, History, and Women's Studies at the University of Maryland in College Park and the University of Maryland University College. So I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Dennis Doster.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here. I forgot to put into this presentation, but generally when I go somewhere, I always begin with a discussion of what the Black History Program is. But because I think I was at the commission, I said I'm not going to do that. But since I'm here, I will say just briefly a little bit about it. So if people aren't aware, that they will know now. So the Black History Program has been in existence since 1982. Really came to being because of a community push, people in Prince George's County pushing for there to be some sort of research and work done. Of course, a lot of that was done here in the planning department to document and record the history of African Americans in the county. So we've been in existence since 1982. Our scope of work has expanded since that time period. So we manage 3 historic properties: Abraham Hall, which is back there I saw, Dorsey Chapel, and the Ridgely Rosenwald School. We do programming throughout the year, such as our first Tuesday's programming, which is a lecture, film, and discussion series based on African American history. We do programming now related to Afro-Latinx heritage, so we've done a number of programs related to that. We do our annual Black History Month exhibition, of course, and so this coming February 2020, our exhibition will be on Black women in politics. And then we also do a big Juneteenth celebration, which is currently now at Watkins Regional Park. We just had I think our largest one to date with close to 6,000 people that came out. So we're trying to keep growing that particular celebration. So that is my little short spiel about Black History Program. So today I'm talking about beyond the courthouse lawn, a history of racial violence on the border. And so first, I wanted to break down a little bit, or give a little more context on where exactly this title came from. So the first part of the title comes from this important book, which was published in 2007. Since then, it's been revised, and more recently, 2018, another edition came out with a foreword by Brian Stevenson of the Equal Justice Initiative. And so this book is On the Courthouse Lawn by Sherilyn Ifill. She is currently the president and director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Prior to that, she had served as 20 years as faculty in the civil procedure and constitutional law, teaching those subjects in the School of Law at the University of Maryland in Baltimore. And so she was there from '93 for about 20 years, and then she left and went to the Legal Defense Fund. And so in this particular work, Ifill looks at lynchings, and she looks at how average white citizens, some of them who actively participated in lynchings, and then others who witnessed and were complicit in those acts of atrocity. And she specifically focuses on 2 lynchings in the state of Maryland: the 1931 lynching of a man by the name of Matthew Williams, and then the 1933 lynching of a man by the name of George Armwood. Both of these lynchings taking place on the eastern shore of Maryland. And then another, and which will kind of come back up again in this presentation, another important part of her work is that she was inspired by South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the kind of ideas behind restorative justice. And so she posits that there are ways in which we can talk about, study, and remember lynchings that we should today. And so she talks about including placing gravestones on unmarked burial sites of lynching victims, issuing public apologies, establishing mandatory school programs on the local history of lynching, and then also financially compensating those whose family homes or businesses were destroyed in the aftermath of lynching. And so she kind of sets this framework, and we see this come up again and again, especially more recently with the work of the Equal Justice Initiative, which I will talk about in a little bit more detail. One thing I did forget to say before I go further, that this is a presentation about racial violence and lynching, and so there will be some details that are potentially disturbing and graphic, and some videos actually that will be graphic. So if you don't want to experience that right now and you want to step out and watch, I believe this is being recorded, watch this later or do that, feel free to do that. That's understandable. But I think part of what we're talking about when we talk about restorative justice, talking about speaking truth, it's important to tell these stories and tell these stories in full, even if they're unsettling and disturbing. And so that's part of why I am showing these images. Real funny, a professor I used to have in graduate school, she mentioned how at one point she was doing some teacher workshops with, I think, elementary and middle school teachers, and they were, pushing back against the ideas of showing these images, saying that kids don't need to be exposed to violence. And she said, these kids are exposed to violence every day. And so that, this is something that needs to be told, and that we need to push back against those who say that this is too graphic or too violent to show. And so then I also wanted to explain the second half of my title, so a racial history of violence on the border. And so one of the things that, of course, in this current news cycle, when we hear the word border, we automatically think of what's going on the U.S.-Mexican border. But I wanted us to kind of, in using this as part of the title, push back against that to say that that's not the only border that we have, first off. But then also, when we're looking at history through the lens of African Americans, the border takes on another meaning and importance. And so when we think about borders and talking about African American history, we could be talking about the border between the United States and Canada, and thinking about how that was an important border as people escaped along the Underground Railroad. We think about borders between different states as moving from slavery to freedom. We can also talk about borders between rural and urban and how that has shaped African American life. And so all of that, I think, is important when we think about what the term border means. And then also we can think about it in relationship to the state of Maryland being what we would call a border state. So this is one of those states that separates the North from the Deep South, but also is one of those states that does not secede during the Civil War. So those states are, well, I'll ask you all. I like to be interactive. Maryland is one, so we know that. Does anybody know the other border states that did not secede during the Civil War? West Virginia, which actually was created during the Civil War. So Maryland, West Virginia, Kentucky, you have two more, Missouri, and then little old Delaware. So those are the states that we're talking about when we talk about border states. And these states are important because in looking at the history of these particular states, we see ways in which they are kind of caught between two worlds. And so we see that, there's slavery very much existing in all of these states. All these states are very much Southern. I was just reading something recently that was talking about Maryland as if it was not a Southern state. Maryland is a Southern state. So they had slavery existing alongside abolitionist movements. They had industry existing right alongside agriculture. You had warring factions in political parties, so Democrats and Republicans. So the Maryland as this border state really encapsulates kind of these dual things that we see going on, especially in the 19th century. And so here I have a map that shows a little bit of information about, like I said again, once again, I wanted to re-emphasize that Maryland actually was a slave state and that slavery really did play an important part in the state of Maryland. So we see here a map of Maryland in 1860. And we can see here the counties ranked by the percentage of the slave population in each one of the counties. So we see that really during this time period, the slave, and I can use my pointer, right? I thought I saw it. But we can see here that in southern Maryland, that was really the area in which slavery was concentrated, so right along the Chesapeake Bay. So just a little bit more context, around 1800, over half, about 58% of Maryland is made up of a slave population. But by 1860, a sixth of the state's population is enslaved. So we see kind of this decrease in the importance of slavery in the state as a whole, but we definitely see how in these counties in southern Maryland, how slavery still is an important part of their identity, and that of course translates into what happens in those areas of the state in the years after the Civil War. And so now move on to looking at the Equal Justice Initiative. Has anybody ever heard of that? Okay, so a couple of people. So this was founded in 1989 by a man by the name of Bryan Stevenson. You see his pictures there. He is a widely acclaimed public interest lawyer. He is also a best-selling author. And so he established, like I said, in 1989, this private 501c3 nonprofit organization, and it provides legal representation to people who have been illegally convicted, unfairly sentenced, or abused in state jails and prisons. And so specifically one of the things, the goals of the Equal Justice Initiative is, and this is a quote, they are committed to ending mass incarceration and excessive punishment in the United States, to challenging racial and economic injustice, and to protecting basic human rights for the most vulnerable people in American society. And so as a part of that, more recently, what the Equal Justice Initiative has done is this reporting and research on lynching in the United States. And so they have more recently, like I said, launched this really a national effort to create new spaces, markers, and memorials that address the legacy of slavery, lynching, and segregation, and look how those things have shaped what is going on today. And so I have a short video.
We are haunted in America by our history of racial inequality. I think that our history of lynching casts a shadow over the modern death penalty.
The Supreme Court was urged today to strike down the death penalty because it is applied unequally to black and white.
The court said a certain amount of bias is inevitable.
The injustices in these cases literally jump out at you when you look at them. So that really, their trial is just a legal lynching.
So we set up this project to provide legal services to poor people, incarcerated people.
Brian is the work. There's no way to separate him.
When Brian started in Montgomery, they were getting a lot of bomb threats.
I feel protective of him because people don't like what he has to say or things that he's done.
Tonight we are taking this broken history, this inequality and injustice, and we're trying to do something with it.
My clients have been broken by trauma, broken by bias and discrimination.
We are going to be able to get some people over to safe passage, but there are going to be other people that's not going to happen.
I think it's important that we understand all the ugly details, because those are the things that actually give rise to what might allow us to one day claim something really beautiful.
So that's a new documentary on HBO that's coming out. It kind of talks about Brian Stevenson and his work. And so here I want to move and just talk a little bit more generally about a history of lynching in the United States. On your left, you see the cover of the report that was done by EJI, Lynching in America. And actually, if you go to their website, you can pull that up if you are interested in reading the report in detail. And then on the right-hand side, there is an image, and that image is from an exhibition, and it's called Reckoning with the Incident, John Wilson Studies for a Lynching Mural. And that exhibition is actually up right now at the David C. Driscoll Center at the University of Maryland. I believe it'll be up for about 2 more weeks, so if you're interested in going to see that, you have about 2 more weeks to go and see that. So back to information about lynching. So like I said, the Equal Justice Initiative has done a lot of great work, and really they've built upon previous work and have expanded kind of the information that we know about lynching in the United States. So at one point we had a number of about 3,000. Now today we believe we have a number of over 4,000, actually 4,084 racial terror lynchings that occurred in 12 southern states between the end of Reconstruction in 1877 and 1950. And so then also they've documented over 300 racial terror lynchings in other states during this time period. The largest numbers were found in, so they are able to pinpoint to the county where the largest numbers were found in. And so they were found in Jefferson County, Alabama, Orange, Columbia, and Polk counties in Florida, Fulton, Early, and Brooks counties in Georgia, Cato, Quachita, Bossier, Iberia, and Tangipahoa parishes in Louisiana, Hinds County, Mississippi, Shelby County, Tennessee, and Anderson County, Texas. And so in looking at lynchings, it's also important not just to know the number, but also to know what's the reasoning behind these lynchings. And so that they were primarily used as this tool to enforce Jim Crow laws and racial segregation. And so this is happening during the period that we call the nadir. And so that's a term that is originated by a scholar, a historian by the name of Rayford Logan, who was a professor at Howard University. And so he really, when he uses that term, he's applying it basically to this period that was roughly from the 1890s to the first 2 or 3 decades of the 1900s. And so what his argument is, and it's an argument that people have continued to use and advance, is that really after the Civil War, African Americans were beginning to get a lot of rights. You have African Americans that were in legislatures in South Carolina and Mississippi. They are going out and voting, that they are exercising, even though they're limited, but they are exercising rights as free men and as citizens of the United States. But what we see happen as we move further away from that time period, as we move away from Reconstruction, is that we see this gradual stripping away of rights. And we see ways in which Southern governments are putting in place laws and other means to deprive African Americans of those rights. And so one of the things that we see also during this time period is an increase in racial violence. And so this racial violence being a tool to kind of enforce that African Americans need to stay in their place, which is a subservient, inferior place in society. Also, what we see when we look at the report and just kind of general studies of lynching is a certain kind of a number of factors that we see as being kind of prevalent, that we see come up again and again. And so one of the things is that we often see lynchings, the rationale behind lynchings being some sort of fear or attack against by a black man against a white woman. So this fear of interracial mixing, which we see come up again and again. We also see lynchings as a response to kind of social transgressions in society. And so ways in which when we see, once again, African Americans who are moving out of whatever their place is in society. And so we see lynchings as being a response to that. And then also we see a lot of lynchings, or a number of lynchings, being kind of these public spectacles. And so where there are these big gatherings that people are kind of invited to. And so they're kind of celebratory for the white community that is enacting this violence upon these African Americans. And also it functions as kind of a message to the rest of the black community that this will happen to you if you engage in the same type of transgression. So we see that kind of dual goal of them. And I think I have another. And so that's just a website I wanted to bring up, and if you're interested and you want to look at it sometime later, it's monroeworktoday.org. And so in this particular website is honoring the work of an African-American sociologist by the name of Monroe Work, who was at Tuskegee. And he did a lot of this kind of early work in the 30s, 40s that was documenting lynchings in all of these different places. And so the work that the Equal Justice Initiative is doing now is really coming off of this work that he did decades ago. And so like when you go to their website, you have here just information about him and his life and career. But then also if you go up to, I think this is it. I know. If you click on map, you get this interactive map. And the more you scroll in, the more. Not coming up now, but the more you scroll in, the more it'll give actually more specific detail on different lynchings in different actual specific locales. And so this is a quote taken from the actual report. And so what the report focuses on are what they refer to as racial terror lynchings, or looking at these lynchings which they deem as acts of terrorism. And so they say, we also distinguish terror lynchings from racial violence and hate crimes that were prosecuted as criminal acts. Although criminal prosecution for hate crimes was rare during the period we examined, such prosecutions ameliorated those acts of violence and racial animus. The lynchings we document were acts of terrorism because these murders were carried out with impunity, sometimes in broad daylight, often on the courthouse lawn. These lynchings were not frontier justice because they generally took place in communities where there was a functioning criminal justice system that was deemed too good for African Americans. Terror lynchings were horrific acts of violence whose perpetrators were never held accountable. Indeed, some public spectacle lynchings were attended by the entire white community and conducted as celebratory acts of racial control and domination. And so that's kind of just giving you a very specific definition of what they're looking at in this report. But also, I'll come back to this definition a little bit later because I want us to talk a little bit and delve into a little bit of when we use this definition, what do we lose, particularly when we look at a place like Maryland. So when we talk about a racial terror lynching, kind of one of the most prominent examples and probably one of the more well-known is the lynching of Jesse Washington, which took place in 1916 in Waco, Texas. And well, this won't let us play it because it's too graphic. So there were two links. So one was a video, but the other is an article from The Undefeated, which is a really good article which kind of lays out the complete history of that particular lynching. And so once again, we see here a young black man, I believe he's 16 or 17, who's accused of attacking a white woman. And so he's automatically locked up and charged with this attack. as we see eerily see in a number of cases, there are kind of things about, well, not necessarily a lot of cases, but a number of cases. We see cases where people who are clearly either some sort of mental challenge or defect are the ones who are targeted, and understandably, those are ones who can't are even less able to defend themselves. And so here he's described as being feeble-minded in a lot of the records. And so they take him out of the courthouse, and this huge crowd, which you can see some of these pictures in the background, and lynch him. And if we watch that, oh, there, that's an even better image. And so if we watch that video, they'll talk about not just that they strung him up and you know, hung him and then set him on fire, but they tortured him during this particular lynching. And so they, as he struggled to kind of save himself, they would lower his body into the fire and then pull it back out. And so they're doing all this torture to him while he's still alive. They're cutting off his fingers and other extremities. And you see the huge crowd that is there as he's being lynched. And so it says and 10,000 people is the estimate of how many who gathered to witness this particular lynching. And there you see some of the other images. And so one of the reasons why this particular lynching is even more well known is because this is shortly after the founding of the NAACP. And so the NAACP, part of their platform, which of course is multifaceted in terms of fighting for black rights, but one of the things that they're doing is fighting against lynching. And so they send a woman, a white woman by the name of Elizabeth Freeman, who is a British suffragette. They send her down to Texas because she can easily blend in with the crowd to see what's going on after Washington is arrested. And so she's there. I think she's there right after the lynching takes place. And so she gets a lot of firsthand interviews, she gets photographs, and then she takes that and brings it all back to New York to W.E.B. Du Bois, who's editor of the Crisis magazine, which is the official publication for the NAACP. And they publish this story, which is like 10 pages long, detailing kind of all of these horrific actions, and then not just detailing it, but providing that visual evidence as well. And so we see how they're very much working to fight against lynching during this time period. And so going back to the work of the Equal Justice Initiative, what they're doing is saying that this history needs to be told. It needs to be told on a broader scale. So not just the story of Jesse Washington, but all the stories in all these counties all over the South and even outside the South as well. And so they created the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, which part of it is about telling the story of lynching, but its broader story is about talking about Jim Crow and racial segregation. This one should
It speaks to a difficult past,
And so this was a little piece that was done on PBS NewsHour.
It's a haunting feeling to descend beneath a forest of steel columns, symbols of a haunted American past, the systematic lynching of thousands of African Americans. As we walk, they rise. So it becomes what?
Yes, well, it becomes more sobering to now know that these figures are being raised up above you, this violence is being raised above you, but that was the menace and the threat and the terror that lynching was designed to create.
The National Memorial for Peace and Justice, a project led by civil rights attorney Brian Stevenson, sits on 6 acres on a grassy hill overlooking downtown Montgomery, Alabama. Construction continued during our visit. This is a city resonant with the history of racial strife. The first White House of the Confederacy. Statues and memorials to Confederate leaders. The church where Martin Luther King Jr. preached. The bus stop where Rosa Parks became a symbol of resistance. It's also home to Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative, a legal advocacy organization which documented more than 4,400 lynchings between 1877 and 1950, putting names and stories to mostly forgotten victims.
Most of us have no understanding about the legacy of slavery. We have no understanding about the era of lynching. Black people were routinely pulled out of their homes and hanged and burned and drowned and mutilated and tortured, sometimes on the public square with thousands of people cheering on that torture.
At the memorial, more than 800 rectangular steel monuments suspended from the ceiling, rising in height, rusted and stained, some as if bleeding. Each represents a county where lynchings occurred, with victims' names and dates of death, some with just a few, others with dozens, and many more unknown.
It's only when we find a way to talk about these things, when we tell the truth about these things, that we can create new relationships. That's what truth and reconciliation is about. It's just that we can't skip any steps. Truth and reconciliation is sequential. You've got to tell the truth first, and then you get to reconciliation.
I mean, this is a kind of, I don't know if obsession is the right word, but this missing link in our history, from slavery to, let's say, the civil rights movement.
Yeah, it is a compulsion. I want to be free. I want all of us to be free. And I don't think any of us are free, black or white. We are constrained by the smog created by this history. And to deal with that, we're going to have to clean the air. We're going to have to talk about some things we haven't talked about before.
One of the names here, Elmore Bowling, killed in 1947 in Lowndes County, Alabama, less than 30 miles from Montgomery.
He was killed simply because he was too prosperous to be a Negro farmer.
Josephine Bowling McCall was just 5 when it happened. One white man was arrested at the time but never prosecuted. Her father had started a business employing other African Americans, and Josephine believes he was murdered for violating the racist social contract of the time.
It was maintaining status quo, and that is the black man was never supposed to achieve the level and level of success that white men had. We were never to aspire. It even kills your aspirations when you think about when someone is murdered like that.
She remembers not just the terror from her father's killing, their family fled to Montgomery shortly after his death, but the pain that came from justice denied.
There is an emptiness that one doesn't get over easily, especially when you're wondering why. Why was he so brutally killed? And then once you find out that it's really for naught, then it really, really hurts.
Along with the memorial, Stevenson's organization created the Legacy Museum downtown that traces African American history through 4 eras. It begins with enslavement and recognizes the troubled past of this very site, once used to warehouse slaves. In the period of lynching and racial terror during Reconstruction, postcards in which white spectators pose by hanging bodies, and large jars containing the actual soil from the ground where lynchings occurred. In the 20th century into the civil rights era, a collection of laws across the country, some banning activities as trivial as playing cards with a black person. Finally, our own time, a period of mass incarceration. Stevenson has spent decades defending wrongfully convicted prisoners, some of whose stories can be heard here.
I think slavery didn't end, it evolved. And for the last 160 years, 170 years, we've been dealing with the legacy of slavery. And you can see that manifest in lynching and in segregation and presumptions of dangerousness and guilt that challenges us today. I see young kids who are being born into a world where they are still weighed down with that burden. And so I want to get us to the point where we get past that. That's how we're going to get past these police shootings of unarmed black men and women. That's how we're going to get past the wrongful convictions of people of color. We're not going to get there if we don't deal with this legacy.
You are, of course, forcing people in some way to look at ugly things.
Yes.
Right?
I mean, you can't live in a community where most people in the community came out and cheered while someone was burned alive, or someone was tortured, or someone was hanged, and expect to be a healthy community by never talking about it. It just doesn't work that way. That stuff festers. It's too traumatizing. It's too painful. It's too terrifying to just evaporate. It's in the air. And communities of color still feel that pain, that menace, that anguish. And they're being told they can't talk about it either.
Stevenson modeled his new project on those in other countries such as Germany and South Africa, which have publicly faced their pasts. Where are we in remembering?
We are nowhere. I mean, we're the opposite. We're actually trying to romanticize these periods that are actually periods of great trauma and shame. And that's why I think these projects are so important. We should create a new kind of iconography that we can all be proud of. I don't want segregated iconography, segregated memorials. I want an honest accounting of our history, a reckoning with our history, and then I want to see how we want to deal with that.
To that end, Stevenson is creating replicas of each of these markers and inviting counties to take theirs home for public display in memory of the victims. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown in Montgomery, Alabama.
So, as I said, that shows you a little bit about kind of the whole museum that's down there. Has anybody been? No. So, I have not been either. So, we're all hopefully can go and see that. But just kind of the work that he's doing down there, and then also in the video, kind of it links to a couple of things that I meant to mention, that how really he's looking at lynchings and reporting about lynchings and talking about this legacy that exists and looking at how it influences all the way up to today, and looking at things like mass incarceration and looking at kind of this line from slavery to the present day. And then also looking at how these events, even though they were decades ago, have consequences that reverberate throughout the generations. And so looking at those family members that are left behind, looking at that wealth that is taken away from families, or that whatever else is kind of negatively attributed to that. And so as it said in the end, that they're encouraging states and counties to do their own work around lynching. And so we have here in the state of Maryland, the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project, which was established a little bit over a year ago. It's a 501c3, and it's really doing that same work of the Equal Justice Initiative as it relates to lynching, but on the local level, at the state of Maryland level. And so what you see there at the bottom is a image of back in April of this year, when a law was passed, which was HB 307. And so that creates the Maryland Lynching Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so what that commission is going to do is really study these lynchings that we know about. And so we know of about 40 that happened, and really look at, telling the truth as it relates to these lynchings, looking at what other things that we can do as it relates to reconciliation, as it relates to these lynchings. And the state of Maryland is the first state to create a Truth and Reconciliation Commission as by law. And so Maryland really is kind of out in the forefront and kind of hopefully setting an example for what other states can do. And the primary sponsor of this legislation was Delegate Jocelyn Pena-Melnick, who is one of the representatives for Prince George's. Her district, I think, covers Prince George's County and Anne Arundel County. So what is the history of lynchings as it relates to Maryland specifically? And so as I mentioned, that we know of about 40 to 45 that occurred in the state of Maryland. Out of that number, we know that in Prince George's County, does anybody know how many were in Prince George's County?
4.
Close. 5. So we know of, and that's a key word when we talk about lynchings, that there are plenty of kind of other acts that we might not necessarily know about, but in terms of ones that were recorded or somebody reported it back, we know of 5 that occurred in Prince George's County. And I think I have a map up here where you can see where they occurred. Anybody want to guess where they occurred? So, Upper Marlboro, yes.
Bowie.
Not Bowie. So there's 2 sites. So this is the page on the Maryland Lynching Memorials website. So mdlynchingmemorial.org if you want to check out their page. But on there they have this page that's lynchings in Maryland, where once again they have another map. And these maps just don't seem to be working for me today. But when you zoom in, you can click on and see where these lynchings occurred. And so in Prince George's County, they occurred in Upper Marlboro, in Oxon Hill, and in Piscataway. So all of them are in the southern part of the county, which you would kind of think, because if you look at the population during this time in history, the largest numbers of African Americans are living in those rural agricultural, well, the whole county is rural, but those more agricultural portions of the county. And so those sections of the county with the strongest ties to enslavement. And I like this one is a little bit better. But this is through the Baltimore Sun, and so that's one of the Prince George's County lynchings. But that one actually will show the name and it'll give you a little bit more information about the actual lynching itself. So news.baltimoresun.com, Maryland-lynchings. And so the history of lynching in the state of Maryland, we officially ended in 1933 with the lynching of George Armwood on the Eastern Shore. And so one of the things that the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project has done is do this particular documentary, and it's a short documentary. I'm not going to show all of it. I'll just show a little brief part of it. But it's about the lynching of George Armwood. And so that's one of the things that the state organization is doing to kind of spread this history as it relates to lynching. See if this...
They beat him, and they stabbed him, and they hung him, and they set him on fire. They knew in advance what was going to happen.
The decision to take him away from the safety of Baltimore City was a tragic mistake.
They made me think a black man's life was worth anything.
Like the rest of the country, the 1930s were a difficult time in Maryland.
With the Depression, families, and it didn't matter whether they were black or white, most people were in dire economic straits.
And in the 30s, the Eastern Shore was predominantly agricultural and absolutely segregated. Jim Crow was alive and well in the 30s on the shore.
The threat to blacks on the shore was magnified by anger over the case of Ewell Lee, a black man also known as Orphan Jones. In January of 1932, Lee was convicted of murdering a white family of 4 in Berlin. Lee's lawyer was Bernard Adas, a communist from Baltimore. He not only got Lee's original conviction reversed, but managed to drag the case on for years, infuriating whites.
He was despised on the lower shore, even though he was a tremendously effective defense attorney for his client.
In October of 1933, the Lee case was still unresolved when an elderly woman named Mary Denston said she was attacked by a black man while walking home near Princess Anne. She said she didn't know her assailant, but would be able to identify him among 1,000. Word of the attack spread quickly. Soon, hundreds of men from 3 counties joined the manhunt. The man they were hunting was George Armwood, a 22-year-old farm worker who lived near Pocomoke City.
My grandmother's name is Mary Armwood. You know, it was her family, it was her relative, and she was there.
Tina's grandmother had fond memories of her cousin.
And he would come by a lot, and he seemed like a really nice guy. He was always smiling, he was very friendly, and she said he used to whistle a lot.
When he was 15, George left school to live and work with a white man on a nearby farm. Armwood, the Afro learned, was reared by a white family and recognized by many to be feeble-minded and a fit subject for a psychopathic ward. He was not put in one because, in spite of his mental infirmity, or because of it, he was a good workman and an inexpensive one. Even before Mrs. Denston had a chance to identify him, Armwood was named as her attacker. It's not clear why.
I'm not sure that Armwood committed a crime at all. From what we know, and the fact that he was described as being dim-witted, I'm not sure if he committed a crime. When you're looking for someone to blame for something, you find a scapegoat. The weakest victim, the weakest person you can find, and you choose that person.
Whatever the reason, Armwood was a wanted man. The search intensified, and the next day an armed posse entered the Armwood home, demanding to know where George was.
And then they started threatening them, telling them that if, they didn't give him up, and if they knew where he was, that they would hurt all of them. Eventually, they seen him being dragged out of the woods. And she said that they pulled him out and they were beating on him, and then they tied him to the back of a car and made him walk.
In a time of anxiety and anger, Armwood's capture was like lighting a fuse.
The Yule Lee case was still very much in the headlines, but here comes George Armwood, another African American accused of a crime against a white woman.
They had just lynched Matt Williams 2 years prior to. And then also the people in Worcester County were still in uproar because what happened to Orr Lee, called Orphan Jones, because it took 2 years before he was brought to justice, and they wanted it to happen immediately.
Armwood was first taken to the Princess Anne jail, but fearing trouble, police took him to the Wicomico jail in Salisbury, the very place where Matthew Williams was lynched not 2 years earlier. As news of Armwood's capture spread, angry crowds began to gather. It was clear he wasn't safe in Salisbury either, so Governor Albert Ritchie ordered state police to take Armwood away from the shore altogether. Just as Armwood was led out the back door, the mob burst through the front. From Salisbury, Armwood was taken first to Cecil County and then to the Baltimore City Jail, where it was reported he signed a confession. In Baltimore, Armwood was out of the reach of shore mobs, but the respite was short-lived.
Judge Robert Dewar ordered that Armwood be returned to the Somerset County Jail after he had been assured by Sheriff Luther Daugherty and by State's Attorney John Robbins that they had everything under control. I could not understand why Judge Dewar would do such a thing because he was a circuit court judge. He wasn't a law enforcement officer. I found out later from his granddaughter that Judge Dewar was up for re-election the next fall.
Robbins told Ritchie the danger of violence had passed. He said Somerset County is law-abiding and peaceful. Judge Dewar also assured the governor, but he may have been more concerned with assuring his constituents.
Judge Dewar realized that if he didn't bring Armwood back, it would be considered a repudiation of his own community. So to his shame, he had him come back.
Ritchie also faced re-election, so he agreed, and at 10 o'clock that night, a convoy of state police left Baltimore with Armwood in tow. When the sun came up on October 18th, George Armwood was sitting in a cell at the Princess Anne jail. Everyone on the shore knew it. His return was trumpeted in the papers and on the radio. Predictably, the jail attracted the curious and the furious. People arrived by the hundreds. The danger was clear and growing. The troopers who brought Armwood back stayed to guard the jail, but there were only 25, and the mob now numbered in the thousands. The American Legion refused to provide reinforcements, and Robbins refused to allow Armwood to be returned to Baltimore. Reports of unrest soon reached the governor. Again, Ritchie called Robbins and Dewar, and again each man assured him that Armwood was safe. But with every minute, the mob was getting larger and more menacing. At 7 o'clock, Dewar went to the jail himself to talk.
I'll stop this there. But that just gives you a little bit of the beginning of that particular story. And as I said, that's the last reported lynching in the state of Maryland, that of George Armwood on the Eastern Shore. And so that really brings us to a question is, what is missing when we talk about lynching, particularly as we talk about lynching here in Maryland and here in Prince George's County? Because when we look at the numbers, that 40 to 45 pales in comparison to other places in the South. And so looking at, a place like Mississippi or Georgia or Florida where they have hundreds during this time period and they're only 40 to 45, what does that mean? That's the question that we should be asking. And so does that mean that the state of Maryland, including Prince George's County, was just this place of racial equality and for the most part people got along and there wasn't any kind of racial strife? No, that's not what it means. And so one of the things I think is important for us to think about when we are telling this narrative, of course, if we go by the Equal Justice Initiative's model, there is this focus on racial terror lynchings. But the fact of the matter is racial terror lynchings did not happen in all places, but that does not mean that there was not racial violence and racial strife that was taking place. And so we have to think about how is geography important when we look at these different places. So looking at Maryland as a border state, one of the things that separates Maryland from a place, say, like Mississippi, is that black people in Maryland had political rights. They went to the polls and exercised those rights from the late 1800s through the present. Now, did that always work in their behalf? No. But they still are using the political machines. They're electing people to local government, and they are kind of playing sides with Democratic Party and the Republican parties. You look at different elections, there are different politicians that will try and court the black vote to a certain extent. So we see political rights being a part of the story here in Maryland. We see strong institutions in the state of Maryland. So when I mean institutions like political organizations or benevolent organizations or churches, if you look at a place like Baltimore, they have churches that date all the way back to the early 1800s. And so these institutions are much stronger than in a place like Georgia or Mississippi, which is an important part for this kind of fighting against lynching and other wrongs in society. And we think about Maryland and we think about Prince George's County specifically. One thing that's important is, once again, geography, thinking about how Prince George's County is situated between Washington, D.C. on one hand and Baltimore on the other hand. And so how being very close to Washington, D.C., they had access to certain resources that were there and that people could come into the county and help out at certain times. And I'll talk about one story shortly in which they do that. And then also you see that same thing in Baltimore, as it was mentioned in that piece that you saw, how a lot of times there was movement between Baltimore and a lot of these different counties. And so Baltimore is the, I think, second city in the nation to develop its own chapter of the NAACP. And so that chapter is very much concerned with what's going on in Baltimore, but they also are looking at what's going on throughout the rest of the state. And the Afro-American, the black newspaper, was reporting about what's going on in the rest of the state, including in Prince George's County. And so So my argument is that as we in the state of Maryland begin to look at these racial terror lynchings, is that we can't just look at racial terror lynchings alone. If we are going to fully tell the truth, if we're going to fully be involved in restorative justice and reconciliation, we must also look at a broader range of racial violence. It's just not just this story of 45 people or, in the case of Prince George's County, 5 people that we need to tell. And so with that said, I was going to talk about 2 stories briefly. And so I think I first gave a presentation on this story maybe about 3 years ago. And so this man by the name of Omer Weems, who lived in Beltsville. And so what you see here is a picture of his World War I draft registration card. And he actually served in World War I. He served abroad with the French in World War I, came back home safe, started a family, had a wife, had 2 children. Then on the evening of Sunday, October 19th, 1924, police in Laurel received word about a domestic disturbance. And so the police and the state troopers go out to Laurel to search for this man by the name of Edward Brooks, who's been accused of beating his wife. Upon going to his residence, they don't find Brooks, and so they begin searching in the neighborhood. At this same time, Omer Weems is on his way home from work. The police, who are not in uniform, approach him with guns drawn, and what does Omer Weems do? He turns his back and runs because he sees these white men who have no uniforms on approaching him with a gun. And then what do? They shoot him in the back and in the head and kill him. And so after they shoot him and kill him, they leave his body there. They return to the police station in Laurel, and they make it known what happened. Eventually, this case goes to trial. They're charged with 2 of the officers are charged with manslaughter. But while we know a lot of the details of this, going back to the importance of the black press and in Baltimore, the Afro-American, is the Afro-American covers this story, and they are very outraged, and they're talking about how people in the community and across the state are outraged by this killing. And so by December of that year, like I said, 2 of the state policemen are placed on trial and charged with manslaughter. They go to court in Upper Marlboro, and ultimately they're not found guilty, but they do get a fine of $500 each. And so one of the things that I'm continuing to do is trying to do a little bit more research on tracking down the family of Omer Weems. We know exactly where he was buried. We don't know where his grave is exactly. But as I said, he was a veteran, so he does deserve at least an official grave from the federal government because of his service. And then also that can be a part of this whole, as we think about what restorative justice means and reconciliation means, how do we tell this story as well, not just the stories of lynching as well. And so then also there is a story of the murder of another black man by the name of Cater Stevens. He's not in this picture, but the one person that is in this picture that's important to this story, does anybody know anybody that's in that picture? Thurgood Marshall. So Thurgood Marshall is important to this story. So at this time, Bladensburg and the Bladensburg police office was known as being particularly vehemently racist. And so Cater Stevens, he was a working class laborer who lived in Washington, D.C. He's traveling through, this is 1932, he's traveling through Prince George's County, traveling through Bladensburg on his way home to his home in Northwest with his wife, his home on P Street in Northwest. Then something happens. There's some confusion about what exactly happens. So there evidently is an accident, a minor traffic accident, where Stevens allegedly hits the car being driven by a white woman. There are no bodily injury, but he is, pulled aside by the police. They charge him with being inebriated. And then from there, the story gets even more muddled. And so evidently, according to the police officer, there is some sort of chase that ensues as Cater Stevens attempts to flee from him, and then the officer trips over something and his gun goes off by accident and shoots and kills Stevens by accident. Now, there are also the Baltimore African American and some other sources as well tell the story that there are some black bystanders that see what happened, and they give a very different story. They say that Stevens does run from the officer, and then the officer follows in pursuit of him and then shoots him in the back multiple times, and then comes out of the alley, turns around and shoots again after he was already clearly dead or incapacitated at the least. So this creates this huge uproar in the community. And as I said, Bladensburg at that time and the police in Prince George's County already had this negative reputation. And so because of the proximity to Washington, D.C., one of the leading lawyers in D.C., a man by the name of Belford V. Lawson, comes in and takes the case. And then in taking the case, he's in communication with the NAACP, and then eventually Thurgood Marshall is brought into the case as well. They take the officer, a man by the name of Charles Flory, to court, and of course he's found not guilty. But in this particular case, one of the ways which is important, and it really is important as it relates to the career of Thurgood Marshall, is because when that case is taken to Upper Marlboro, he assists with the case. He's not the lead attorney, but he assists, and this is the first time that a black man is able to do that in Prince George's County. There are no black lawyers in Prince George's County, I believe, until 1950. So this is a good about 15 years prior to that. So this is kind of an important part for Prince George's County history, Maryland history, and then also Thurgood Marshall's legal career. Even though they don't win this case, they do a civil case. In which they sue on behalf of Stevens' widow, Mildred Stevens, and they are successful in the civil case, and they get $1,200. But that kind of is an important kind of turning point in Marshall's career, and it's not too long after that when he goes to New York and takes over the legal department of the NAACP. And so, like I said, those are just kind of two examples of stories that we know about that if you look at racial terror lynchings, they're going to be left out of the story. Also, if we do that kind of narrow definition, we're also leaving out the stories of race riots. And so this month marks the 100th anniversary of the huge race riot that took place in Washington, D.C. right after World War I, in which about a dozen people, black and white, were killed. And it was part of this, what was called the Red Summer, that takes place in the period after World War I. So World War I veterans, black World War I veterans come home with this idea that we fought in this war, the war to save democracy, as Woodrow Wilson called it. We served valiantly. The whole regiments that fought with the French received the Croix de Guerre. So we've proved that we deserve the rights of citizenship as African Americans. And of course, when they come home, the United States says, no, you don't deserve those rights. And so there's a violence that breaks out during this period called the Red Summer throughout a lot of urban areas, including here in Washington, D.C. There are a lot of little interesting stories that come out of that particular riot, particularly how African Americans fight back. So there's stories of black men who take guns and stand on the top of the Howard Theater and aim those guns at the white men that are coming to attack them. There's another story of a white detective who was shot. I think you can see part of that article there. A white detective who was shot when he attempts to go into a black home and attack this black man, and his daughter comes with a gun and shoots him. And so this really is this riot that takes place. And so once again, this is something kind of that's left out of the story when we just focus on lynchings. And so we have to think about, what does racial violence look like when we talk about an urban setting? And so looking at these instances. And so definitely in these instances, the people aren't necessarily as powerless as we would say when we look at a lynching, but also there is an important story to be told there that fits into the narrative of racial violence. More popularly, we can think of what happens in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and think about how that is a whole legacy in itself in terms of how this whole black town is basically destroyed because of a race riot. And we can think about race riots in a lot of other urban places. And then lastly, I think we can also talk about sexual violence, because when we look at lynchings, we're, for the majority, looking at a very male narrative, and women are on the sidelines as those who are left behind. So we do know that there are some African-American women that are lynched, but the overwhelming majority are men. And so women are easily left out of this particular narrative. So when we look at sexual violence, though, it brings more women into that story. Of course, that's harder to trace and find and talk about, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to look for those stories, to tell those stories in some way, commemorate those stories. This woman is a woman by the name of Recy Taylor. Has anybody heard of her? So there's a documentary, and I think this will link to a trailer for the documentary that's about her.
Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report.
Oh, no,
I'm
this is
Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Let me show just like the first 4 minutes of this.
That looks at what happened in 1944 when a 24-year-old black mother and sharecropper was gang raped in Alabama and refused to be silenced. This is a clip from the trailer of the documentary The Rape of Recy Taylor.
So the car pulled up behind me, some white boys. I mean, they ain't said nothing about what they gonna do to me.
This bitter earth.
They put me in the car, then went blindfold me.
What fruit it bears.
I was begging them to leave me alone. Don't shoot me. I got to go home to see about my baby. They wouldn't let me go. I can't help but tell the truth. What they done to me.
That was Recy Taylor herself describing what happened the night 6 white boys abducted and brutally raped her as she walked home from a church service in Abbeville, Alabama. After the men raped Taylor, they left her on the side of a deserted road where she was found by her father. This is another clip from the film, The Rape of Recy Taylor. This starts with her brother, Robert Corbett, followed by her sister, Alma Daniels. They explain what happened to Recy Taylor the night she was raped.
What they did to her. And you know, my sister didn't have any more kids after that. And never got pregnant after that. And they didn't only just have sex with her after they got through mutilating her. They played in her body.
I don't know if she was feeling pain or what. That was after they kept her about 4 or 5 hours down in the woods. 7 guys one night. They said they wanted her to act just like she was in bed with her husband.
The boys had warned Taylor repeatedly that they would kill her if she spoke out. But despite the threats, Recy Taylor identified her rapists, though few women spoke up in fear for their lives. In fact, the rape of black women by white men was so common in Jim Crow South that the NAACP had a chief rape investigator. That person was none other than Rosa Parks. When Rosa Parks went to interview Recy Taylor, we're talking 11 years before the Montgomery bus boycott, the local sheriff kept driving by the house and eventually burst in, threatening Rosa Parks with arrest if she didn't leave town. Parks left and then launched the Alabama Committee for Equal Justice for Mrs. Recy Taylor, triggering a movement to seek justice. Again, 11 years before Rosa Parks became that civil rights hero for refusing to give up her bus seat to a white man, launching the Montgomery bus boycott. For more, we're joined by Nancy Bursky, the producer and director of The Rape of
And that documentary is available, I believe, on Netflix, so if you're interested in seeing that in its entirety. And so, in closing, I'm just going to pose the questions going back to this whole idea of a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. What is truth and what is reconciliation? So, challenging us to think about what truths need to be told and how they need to be told, and how do we go about a process of reconciliation. And one of the key things is thinking about geography, thinking about the local level, and thinking about how that is important in shaping what stories are told and how this process goes forth, and thinking about who's going to be involved. So thinking about historians and scholars, thinking about artists, thinking about community leaders and activists, thinking about planners, how we all can be involved in kind of crafting that narrative and telling that story. So that is it for me. But I guess if you have any questions or comments.
Has there been much engagement for this new initiative by the 2019 state initiative with Larry Hogan? Has communities, is it getting traction?
I think it's still new, so it's still people are still trying to figure it out. I think Anne Arundel County has really been in the lead in terms of counties who are doing something. And so I think September 7th, I believe that's the date, they're going to be putting up the first marker to mark the spot of a lynching victim. And that will be the first that's been done as a part of this project in any county. Like I said, the Prince George's County has just started a group and is still kind of forming, but it really hasn't done anything yet. But definitely, I think Anne Arundel County kind of is in the lead, and so we'll see over the next year how that develops. The Maryland Lynching, the Maryland Lynching Memorial organization, they had their first annual conference last September. They'll have their second one in November at Morgan State, and so I think that'll really be kind of a tell in terms of how much traction is received, in terms of how many people actually show up and come out and be a part. And they have all the information for that on their website.
So has there been any discussion, I don't know if this will come out of the Prince George's Memorial Lynching Committee, to do more mapping around, you've incorporated other acts of racial violence, so not just including, the idea of lynching, but all these other forms of racial violence. Has there been some thought around developing a map like that for the county? I think about stories around bus boycott, or not bus boycotts, but boycotts at Everett and Bowie, how college students were protesting out there, or just all of these other incidences. So yeah, is that something that you all are leaning towards or thinking about doing?
So I've been to a total of, I think 2 meetings of the Prince George's Commission. I think they've had maybe 3. So no, that has not been a discussion yet, but I think that, like I said, the organization is still trying to form. If there are people that are interested, I think you definitely should be a part. And my email, you can get my email and I can give you information about it, so you can attend. To your other point, I was going to say something and I forgot. I think there are ways in which that project can coincide or dovetail with the Civil Rights Project, which you already have heard about, but for everybody else, so that the Anacostia Trails Heritage Area, working in conjunction with my office and working in conjunction with the Prince George's Historical Society, applied for 2 grants, and so one from the National Park Service and one from the state of Maryland, and in total we've received $85,000 to create Prince George's County Civil Rights Trail, and so that will be specifically about civil rights and activism, in which some of that racial violence, definitely the piece about Thurgood Marshall would be a part of that story and stuff like that.
The effort that Governor Hogan has initiated on reconciliation, what is your sense of the form that it's going to take? I know you say it's still being developed, but what form do you think it is going to take, or what form it should take? Are we talking about forums, holding forums, or groups, committees coming together, or are we talking about like monuments or, like you said, what do you call them, the postings that you would have?
Oh, the markers?
The markers signifying where something happened. What do you think is going to be the main kind of like outcome?
I think all of the above are options. I think there will be forming of an official commission. And then also these little county groups will, as they form, will be able to kind of, even if they aren't a part of the commission, be able to give feedback, because really they want this to be community driven. What do people in the community want this to look like, and want for it to, how should it manifest itself? And so if we go back to the model of what Sherilyn Ifill's book, so the book I began with, talked about, that was talking about placing markers, that was talking about placing headstones on burials, that was talking about developing curriculum for schools, all as being a part. But if there are other things that we think should be a part, we can add that as well. And so definitely my voice in trying to be involved with this is saying that when we look at racial terror, we should not just look at racial terror lynchings. We should look at a broader history of racial violence if we're going to look at it specifically in Maryland, because that opens it up to other things that we need to look at, whether it be sexual violence, whether it be police brutality, et cetera, because all of these things also have an effect on what's going on in 2019.
And I think, so that I guess takes me to like where my question is. So, so outside of placing like historical placards or historical markers, I mean, how does this then inform and impact our work as planners, since we're constantly, dealing with, space and land, and in many instances, it sounds like the places where this has actually happened. So I guess like, how do you presume this impacts our work, or how do you think this impacts our work? And what might be some recommendations that you feel like we could take as planners to be able to, I mean, I guess be more aware of this, but then also, just be more aware. I don't know, like if it would even be like addressing some of the stuff in our work.
I mean, I can answer that to a certain extent just because I'm not a planner. So, but as a historian, I think part of it is having you all at the table when these discussions are had. Because even I can say from what I know about what's been going on the state level and the legislation, I don't think the coalition that has been at the table has been broad enough to inform the discussion of what should have been written into law. And so I think now that you know about it, you share that information, and then you try and become involved and engaged, and you can offer a different perspective from what a historian is going to think, or an artist or activist is going to think. And then we think about what's that place in which we come together. So identifying these places is kind of at the top of the list, if we can, the exact spots, and then figuring out, well, what is that spot now? How is it used? Can we reimagine the use of it, or is it someplace where no, we don't want to do that. We want to go somewhere else. As we create these new spaces in our county, do we want to have a centralized space where we tell this story? Do we want to have multiple spaces? What does that look like? I think all of that was like where you all could kind of inform and be in the discussion. Is that kind of, sort of?
My name's Emily Wirtz. I come from Montgomery County. I'm one of those people who are trying to coalesce and work with the Equal Justice Initiative to claim our memorial for Montgomery County victims. We're hoping to put a soil, by working with the EJI, they have their own idea as to how their process works. And in addition to the markers, and ultimately to the memorial that goes countywide, they have soil collections at the place, and we're hoping to do a soil collection in Poolsville at the end of October for George Peck. But we are just organizing. It's at early stages. But EJI does have some of its own ideas. So you have this kind of parallel world of Brian Stevenson, Montgomery, Alabama, and the EJI, and then the statewide commission that the governor signed into law, and then Will Schwartz, who just did it a year ago. And and a lot of people, I think he feels moved by the response. It's like an idea whose time has come. And there are people who want to cooperate with it. But from Montgomery County's point of view, we say, okay, you have markers. And some of us who've worked with the county before say, you don't just make up your mind what you want it to say and go put it there. You're going to have to work with parks. You know, you're going to have, if you're going to put up a marker, it's going to go in a place, and Parks and Planning has to be in on it at a minimum. And since that's part of the EJI formula, I would imagine it would behoove you to work with them as to, and EJI itself is just beginning to work it out. They're trying to figure out their own protocols and trying to make sure that everybody within any given county is aware of each other and what they're doing. But Parks and Planning would be pivotal.
Yeah. And I think they haven't done the soil collection for Prince George's County, so in that video where Brian Stevenson was talking, in the background were like these jars with soil, and then that's what they're doing, where they're going to each site and getting the soil and then putting it in that museum. And so that, you know, just to reference that. And then also I think one of the things though about, and this is kind of personal, kind of also just discussions that I've had with other people, is one of the things that people have been talking about more recently is thinking about just markers in general, and what do markers look like? Because we kind of always create markers in a certain way, and thinking about, you know, is that enough? Are we really harnessing the power of all the technology that we have this day by just doing a marker, or are we doing that in connection with other things? You know, so what is the power of sticking the stake in the ground and having some words on it that people are going to drive past and not read? So.
Do you have links to the PowerPoints that you provided, or a way by which we can access
I can send it to.
I'm not a planner, so I work on a different. I work for the council.
So we have a sign-in sheet, and so Dr. Doster is.
Or I can give you my business card.
Okay.
And you can email me, and I can send it to you.
But will we be able to get?
Yeah, and I can just send it to you too. So yeah, that way everybody.
So, and what will happen? So this is being recorded today, so we will also make it available on the Prince George's County Planning Department's website once it's finished editing, and it'll be there. I think we might also try to use the slides to add to the presentation.
I was jumping back and forth, so I don't know. Any other questions?
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you.